All right, thank you for coming, everyone. We have a special guest today on the day that his new book is released, so this is a real treat for us at Google. Alva Noë is a writer and philosopher specializing in human experience and the philosophy of mind. He holds degrees from Columbia, Oxford, and Harvard, where he earned his PhD. He's now a member of the philosophy faculty at the University of California, Berkeley, as well as Berkeley's Institute for Cognitive and Brain Sciences and the Center for New Media. Outside of academia, you can find his writing on NPR's 13.7 Cosmos and Culture, where he's written about topics from PTSD to Wilmer Flores, the New York Mets. He's the author of 4 books, Action in Perception, Out of Our Heads, Varieties of Presence, and his latest work, which is the aforementioned book released today, Strange Tools. In this subtle and enthusiastic new book, he draws on examples from keeping score at a baseball game to Nirvana to avant-garde art exhibitions to lay out a new way of understanding art, one that avoids the reductionist approach of neuroscience and reframes art as a crucial practice of human life. For more on that topic, and to celebrate the release of Strange Tools, please give a warm welcome to our guest, Alva Noë.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. And yes, it's a very exciting day for me. I've been working on this book for a long time, and I've given dozens of talks about different aspects of the book that feed into it. But I've never given a talk on the book where the book sort of exists already independently of me. And it's an interesting challenge to think about now what to pull from it to share with you as a sort of as an invitation to it. The book is called Strange Tools. It's about art and human nature. The questions that guide the book from start to finish are, what is art? Why does art matter to us as much as it does? What does art tell us, or what can it tell us about ourselves? And I thought I would begin by reading 2 pages from chapter 9, which is called, Why is Art So Boring? Did I hear a chuckle? Do you remember being bored as a kid? I recall summer days during vacation that seem, as I think back on them now, to have been fantastically, impossibly long. Hot, endless, open, without organization, irritating. The buzz of flies, fighting with my little brother, nothing to do, parents remote. By and large, there's no place for this sort of radical boredom in the life of an adult. As you get older, life gets organized around projects and plans and needs and goals. And the result of this congealing of activity is that time speeds up. Or we simply stop paying attention to the metronome and are captured by larger patterns of meaning and organization. Our days are over, one might almost say, before they have begun, for we've already defined the present moment in relation to what is yet to happen, in relation to the purpose, point, or plan. What did you do yesterday? Oh, I went to work. And this is all for the good. It's a necessity. We achieve this. We do not live in the tick-tock motion of sensations and buzzes and one thing after another. It's the mark of our development, of our integration, to use John Dewey's phrase. Our lives are not made up of a series of sensations. They're composed of experiences, experiences that demand to be named. That dinner in Venice, going shopping, the softball game last weekend, my visit here to Google. And these experiences integrate over time. Grown-ups don't get bored. Grown-ups can't get bored. For that distinct emotional state, vaguely painful, that sense of being trapped in the unending and meaningless, that state is available only in the absence of structure, plan, task, obligation. The preconditions for boredom are absent in adult life. Now, what does this have to do with art? My conjecture is everything. The closest I have come as an adult to reliving the florid boredom of childhood is when in the presence of art. That's another chuckle opportunity. Don't get me wrong, I love art. I work with art. I study art. I was raised in a family of artists. Art matters to me. And yet it's hard for me to think of anything more slit-your-wrists dull than some performances, or more excruciatingly sleep-inducing than encountering again a gallery space with pictures on the wall, each of which, to begin with at least, is closed, mute, indistinguishable, and off-putting. It isn't just bad art that is liable in this way to induce that feeling of anxious capture by an endless and meaningless present. I've stood in galleries at the Met or the Frick or other museums that I love and have found myself totally cold in the presence of work that I know and value. It's as if someone failed to press the on button. The work stays off, or I do, and this time spent with art in the standby mode can be a torture. I propose, it's one of the many proposals that I make in this book, that the boringness of art is a clue to what art is and why it matters to us. Any adequate account of what art is and of its place in our lives must address the striking fact that art has the power to bore us. This is a power it maintains when everything else in our lives mitigates against boredom. Art affords us the opportunity to be bored to tears when almost nothing else in our life does. And art's potential to be dull does not contradict the fact that art also moves and thrills and transforms and excites us. Indeed, it's the opposite side of the very same coin. Just as there is no encounter with love without the live risk of heartbreak, so there can be no confrontation with art that does not open up the possibility of getting lulled unconscious and bored to death. Art is valuable only in direct proportion to the degree to which it can or might bore us. Why should this be? So that's chapter 9. And by the time I've gotten there, I've sort of set the stage for what an answer to that would look like. But for now, I want to kind of let that just hang out there with us as a kind of prologue. When I was in graduate school, I studied philosophy, but from the very start, I was interested in cognitive science, and I was especially interested in the study of vision. And one day I found myself in conversation with a man, an older man, an artist, and he asked me to tell him about vision science. What do you do in vision science? And I said, well, the question that we ask in vision science is, how is it that we manage to experience this three-dimensional world of solid objects and surrounding space when what we're given in the retinal image are really distorted, upside down, twitching, shifting, gappy pictures? How do we get from such an impoverished stimulus to such a rich experience? How do we experience so much visually on the basis of so little? And the artist, a man I admired and knew very well, he sort of paused a beat, tried to absorb what I just said, and then he just said, nonsense. The question is not, or should not be, how do we see so much on the basis of so little? The interesting question is why we see so little when there's so much around us to perceive. Well, I came away from that conversation thinking he just didn't understand the point. But years went by, and I wrote the books that were mentioned in the introduction, Action and Perception and Out of Our Heads and Varieties of Presence. And the basic idea of those books, which I wrote from the context of my own active collaboration with scientists, I wrote those books very much with one foot outside of academic philosophy. The basic idea of those books was that we shouldn't think of perception or consciousness or experience as something that happens inside us, not in the brain or anywhere else. We should think of experience, we should think of consciousness as something that we enact or perform. And while it depends on what's going on inside us, in particular in our brains, it can't be reduced to what goes on inside us or in our brains. Perception and consciousness is, so I argued in these books, convincingly or not, as the case may be. Consciousness is an activity. It's a dynamic of involvement with and exchange with the world around us. The body, the world, the brain, the environment, other people make consciousness happen. Trying to find consciousness in the brain, which of course nobody's been able to do, is looking for consciousness in the wrong place. It's like looking for the value of the money in the paper it's printed on, or like looking for the dance in the dancer's body. It's just a confusion. So I argued. And it dawned on me at one point, as I remembered back to that conversation I'd had in graduate school, that I had developed a view. I called it the enactive approach, sometimes the actionist approach, sometimes the sensory motor approach to perception and consciousness, that sort of vindicated what that artist had said to me. There's really two different ways of thinking about experience. You can think of something we achieve and we can fail to achieve, or you can think of experience as something that sort of just happens thanks to the way our nervous system is triggered. And I was plunking down for this other view. So in some sense, I realized, looking back on this work that I've done, that I was arguing that the artist was right. And that was important to me for a number of reasons. But one of them then dawned on me only even more recently, which is that it wasn't just that, and again, you don't have to agree with me about this, but it wasn't just that I'd come to conclude that in some profound sense the artist had been right, but it was important to me, I realized, that the artist was right. That is, I'd gotten this lesson, I'd gotten this insight from an artist and from a perspective that had been afforded to him in some way through his work, through his engagement with, through his valuing art. Now, usually when philosophers or cognitive scientists or psychologists try to write about art, they think of it as a phenomenon that they're going to explain. They're going to tell you why it exists from an evolutionary point of view, or they're going to show you how it works neurologically. But I came away then, again, thinking back on this rich experience that I had, this conversation, thinking, no, we shouldn't think of art as a phenomenon to be explained, but rather art as itself a field of research or a domain of investigation, a kind of inquiry in which explanations are sought. We can think of art itself, the work of dancers and painters, for example, as forms of research. So one of the questions I came to think hard about as I approached writing this book is, well, what kind of research? What kind of research is this? And by the way, long before I wrote Strange Tools, this sort of sounds self-congratulatory, but it's really part of my journey. Long before I wrote Strange Tools, long before I even really framed for myself the idea of writing this book, artists were responding positively to these other books that I'd written, these books that were really written for people interested in the mind and consciousness, really for cognitive science, broadly construed. And they were finding some idea that I was helping them articulate what it was that they were investigating in my work. Anyway, that's kind of an aside. I don't really know how to finish that thought. But the point is, I've come to this point, and in a way, this is perhaps the most salient, most prominent thesis in this book, Strange Tools. One of the main themes of the book is the idea that art is a research practice. Specifically, it is a philosophical practice. I might just as well have said that philosophy is an aesthetic or artistic practice. And one of the things I do in the book is I try to explain that or unpack that or give that meaning, especially give that meaning when terms like philosophy are themselves difficult to define and explain and maybe just as problematic as notions like art itself. And the final position that I arrive at, in which I explain in the body of the book, and which I'll try to explain to some degree with you right now, is that actually the sort of official view at the end is not that art and philosophy are the same, but that each of them is a species of a common genus. And that common genus I call reorganizational practice. And just in a line, the thing about reorganizational practices is that they exhibit us to ourselves, and in doing so, invariably give us the resources, whether we like it or not, to change ourselves. Okay. Let me make a first pass at some of those ideas, in a very informal first pass. I gave a talk at Google a number of years ago when Out of Our Heads came out, and I gave a version of this example then too, because it's a rich example that I come back to again and again. Imagine you go to a gallery, and there you encounter paintings, let's say, and imagine that they're in a style which is completely strange to you. Maybe they're by a painter you've never heard of or never seen, or they're part of a movement that you're unfamiliar with. It's a very familiar, very normal experience that you kind of walk in, maybe you're with a friend, you're talking, the pictures don't grab your attention. They all kind of look the same. They certainly don't fascinate you. And left to your own devices, you might very likely just continue on to the next room looking for something more attention-getting. But I'm interested in what happens when you don't do that, when you don't keep on going, when you don't simply just pass by, but when you stop and take another look and look again. Suppose that the friend you're with is a huge fan of this artist, and she calls your attention to features of the work that you hadn't noticed. Maybe patterns in the composition or in the color scheme or relationship between the different pictures, or maybe she points out something about the order in which the pictures were made, or something about the historical context in which they were made, or the kind of work that was going on at the time they were made, and what this would have meant to people who saw it then. Whatever it might be, sometimes, if you're lucky, something remarkable happens. Whereas all the pieces basically looked the same at first, now they start to pop out at you as individuals. And whereas before they seemed flat and uninteresting, now you start to, as it were, see depth in them, or see into them, see structure, see meaning, and indeed find them to be fascinating. Whereas before they were dull, now all of a sudden they are attention-getting. So I'm very interested in that transition. I mean, I think we have all had that experience. If you've ever spent any time with art, you've had that experience. Or with a record album. I can remember the first time I listened to Led Zeppelin's Houses of the Holy. I couldn't understand what people liked about it. Just one song sounded like the next. I came to love the album, and I came to perceive the structure and subtle differences between the songs. So how do we understand this transformation? It's a transformation which I think of as one from not seeing to seeing. Or as Nicole Peisel, who's here in the audience, put it to me, from seeing to seeing differently. You might say, well, it's a change in you. After all, the works haven't changed. We're not talking about kinetic art or digital art that might actually be changing. I'm just imagining paintings on the wall. So the paintings haven't changed. If there's a change, it's a change in you. But I think it's important to realize that it's not merely a change in what you think or believe, because whatever the change is, I would argue, it's a change that enables you to see what was there all along but that you couldn't see before. It's a change that enables you to bring what is there into focus, to bring it into focus for your conscious experience. All right. Now, one way I could summarize what I'm trying to do in this book is to understand that transformation. I call it reorganization. How is it that in that situation, through active looking, through thinking, through talking, and through interrogating the things before you, that we come to experience them differently. How is it that we reorganize ourselves in that way? Notice that what I described as such doesn't really have anything special to do with art. It's a general feature of our perceptual lives, that through learning and knowledge and talking and interaction, we achieve access to what there is around us in our perceptual lives. Think of how you learn a language and then you can read. You couldn't be offended by the racist graffiti if you couldn't read the language it was in. Suddenly you can read it and boom, you can be hit by it. So we can bring the world into focus through learning. And it can happen really quickly. So in some sense, this gallery example I've given you isn't an art-specific example. But there is something about it which I think is maybe a clue to what makes art special, or at least one of art's special gifts. And that is that a visit to the gallery of this kind is one in which you get the opportunity to catch yourself in the act of doing just that. It's not just that you undergo a transformation, but you realize that you're undergoing the transformation and it's made available to you. Now, for me, that is a paradigmatically philosophical kind of moment where you, in a way, stop business as usual but get to reflect on what you're doing. That's one of the things that philosophy aims at, that kind of self-disclosure or unveiling of oneself to oneself. And, moreover, in this example, it does it in the setting of the exercise of our abilities to look and think and see. That is in the setting of our real lives, in the setting of our lived experience. So the ways in which we reorganize and the ways in which we transform ourselves have to do with perception and consciousness. So if this is right, then there's a sense in which what this encounter with art is affording us is not just an episode in consciousness, but a kind of revelation or an insight into what consciousness is. So I take this to be a very rich example, and I could spend the whole talk just talking about this example. I won't, but I'll just mention as a footnote, it's interesting to think about, to compare this to a Platonic or Socratic dialogue. The kind of transformation that happens in this visit to the gallery for me is very much like what happens between Socrates and his interlocutors in their dialogues. But there is one last note I'll mention before I go on more substantively. And that is, I think this example also gives us a hint as to what goes on when we think about the boringness of art. Welcome. Because what's striking about what was required to set the stage for you to see what you couldn't see, or to see what you saw but differently, what was required was a kind of a disruption, a moment of not being able to see it, a confrontation with stuff that all looked the same. And in our natural, habitual, organized living, the natural thing to do when everything looks the same and uninteresting is to keep on going. But what the work, ritually, sort of the art situation, invited you to do was to disrupt those habits, to put the email away, to stop the conversation, rather the conversation that's unrelated to what's going on around you, and look to the work. And so I think we begin to see a way in which the work creates a setting in which boredom is a stage through which you have to go to make discovery. Okay, so that's a first pass. I now want to approach these issues, these very same issues, but in a slightly different manner. And just in case any of you are pressed for time, I'm thinking that I'll probably go about 20 more minutes, and then there'll be time for discussion. Okay, so cut to a new situation. We're mammals. And the hallmark of mammals is that they suckle at the breast. It turns out that of all the mammals, humans are really bad at breastfeeding. So bad are we at breastfeeding that it's been hypothesized that the function that breastfeeding plays for us isn't primarily feeding, but rather that we feed that way in order to accomplish something else. When I say whether we're bad at it, I mean most mammals will draw milk until they're sated or until another sibling makes them stop, but not the human being. The human being falls asleep. The human being hears a noise and stops. And as a result of this, the mother, and this goes for breastfeeding just as well, it has nothing to do with the mother, with bottle feeding just as well. It needn't be the mother, it needn't be a woman who's engaged in this interaction. But what happens is that the breastfeeder or the feeder needs to have a negotiation with the infant in order to help the feeding happen. So a typical kind of scenario is baby feeds and then falls to sleep. Mother notices that the baby has fallen asleep and jiggles the baby and draws its attention back to the task at hand. And then there's a loud sound and the baby turns and looks at the sound and gets distracted, and mother notices that the baby's no longer feeding and coaxes the baby back to the task at hand, and so on. I'd like you to notice 6 features of this interaction between infant and feeder that I've just described. The first is that in some fairly straightforward, obvious sense, it's primitive, it's spontaneous, it's biological, it's natural. But notice, and this is the second feature, that for all that it's spontaneous and primitive and biological and natural, it's also incredibly sophisticated in the suite of cognitive and perceptual skills that are exercised during it. Doing, undergoing, looking, listening, noticing, responding, communicating. It's a very subtle exchange that happens. It exhibits smarts. Here's a third feature of the breastfeeding scenario. It has a kind of spatial temporal dynamics. It involves rocking and something like turn taking. In fact, it's been noticed that it's sort of remarkable that the one mammalian species with full-blown linguistic powers is also the one species that has this kind of problematic style of breastfeeding. Almost as if to suggest that the breastfeeding itself is a kind of a practice run for conversation, a kind of primitive form of conversation. Here's a fourth feature. Breastfeeding the mother is obviously the authority figure in that exchange, but this dynamic I'm talking about is not one that she dictates or authors. It emerges in the dynamic interaction between them. So this structure, this temporal dynamic, this turn-taking is not written. It evolves, it happens, it emerges. Here's a fifth feature. Breastfeeding obviously has a function. It's embedded in needs, probably the needs for feeding, but maybe other needs, like the needs for the release of oxytocin and the establishment of attachment relationships. Maybe that's why we breastfeed, so that we can enter into that kind of intense dyadic relationship that is so important in our lives. And the sixth feature that I want to mention is that breastfeeding is a place or a site or an occasion or an opportunity for feeling or for affect, and indeed, if all goes well, for pleasure. All right. Now, the reason why I'm describing breastfeeding in my lecture on art at such great length is that I actually think that breastfeeding exhibits a structure which turns out to be very important for understanding human life more generally. I'd like to say that breastfeeding is an organized activity. Now, organized activity, that's English, that's not technical language, but I want to use it in a precise sense, and so in a technical sense, to mean an activity that exhibits those 6 features. that it's primitive and yet cognitively sophisticated, that it exhibits a spatiotemporal dynamics without being authored, that it has a function and that it can be a source of pleasure or feeling. And I want to say that any other activity that exhibits those 6 features is an organized activity too. So I'm using the example of breastfeeding to introduce a concept, the concept of an organized activity. And what I want to offer you is the thought that once you've got the category of the organized activities are very widespread in our lives. Everywhere you look, you see organization of this kind. Unauthored modes of organization in which we find ourselves, as it were by habit, caught up. Take conversation itself. We think of conversation in a sort of classical Western intellectualist philosophical way as 2 intellects expressing thoughts in the garb of language, using a code to communicate. But if you actually watch people talking, and there's a very, very well-established and decades-old literature on this, if you actually watch people talking, something goes on between them which is much more like breastfeeding. So when 2 people talk together, their bodily posture, their tilt, their attitude in relation to what's going on around them, their eye movements, their volume, their distance in relation to each other and things around them, and their word choice are all modulated. There's this incredible coordination that happens between them. It happens spontaneously. It's the very essence of intelligence to be able to participate in it. It's thoughtful. It has a clear, it's a spatial, temporal thing. It's a dynamic of interaction between the people talking, which neither of them is deciding to do. It's not by choice. It's not authored. Conversation is clearly functional, and conversation, when all goes well, is clearly, at least potentially, a source of pleasure. It's definitely a place where we have feelings. Conversation is an organized activity. In my first book, Action and Perception, and I'm not going to review that book here, but I'll just say that I argued that perception is an activity of exploring the environment, making use of a certain kind of sensory motor skill. I used the word activity there without, at the time, having a clear idea of how to analyze what activity might mean. But I now would like to say, and in my book I try to develop the thought, that the relevant kind of activity that perception is an organized activity, one that needn't involve other people. So every time you move, you produce a sensory event. You move your eyes, you move your head, you move your body, you produce a sensory event. You approach an object, it looms in your visual field. You blink, you modulate your sensory relationship to it. We have a kind of dynamic exchange with things around us that I think exhibits the 6 features that I just enumerated that are definitive of organized activity. So the conclusion that I want to make at this point is that we are organized. We are organized throughout our lives. By the way, just a little note, a big theme in the book, and the reason why the book is called Strange Tools, is that I think a major part of the story about how organized activities work in our lives is technology and tools. Just to be very simple right now, tools, I think, function in the setting of modes of organization. So you can look at the thing, you can talk about technology by looking at the evolution of the technologies themselves, or you can think of them as evolving modes of organization. Every tool, every technology is, I think, the hub of organized activities. It's the focal point. It's if you like, it's the organizing principle. It's the thing which sets up and gets the organization going. So organization of this kind is very, very widespread in our lives. One friend of mine who read this book early on said, organized activities sounds like you're writing for a business seminar. Don't talk about organized activities. But I think I like the word organization too, because organization is linked to organism and to biology. We are organisms. And if there's anything that distinctively marks off the difference between the organic and the inorganic, it's its capacity for, as Immanuel Kant put it, self-organization of something like this kind. So I want to offer the thought that organization of this kind, what I'm calling organized activity, is ubiquitous in our life. In some sense, our lives are nested structures of organized activities, or structures of nested organized activities. I want to suggest that this has something to do with what we are as a biological animal. This has to do with our biology. And therefore, any account of organized activity which is going to be adequate needs, or rather, any account of a biology that is going to be adequate to accounting for human nature needs to have something to say about this kind of organization. And finally, and this is a more soft point, but I think we're lost in the seas of our own organization. We don't organize ourselves. We find ourselves organized. Sort of the image that, as I was thinking about how I was going to present this to you this morning, I had this image that popped into my mind of Gregor Samsa, who wakes up one day in the Kafka story and finds that he's turned into an insect. We just find ourselves organized. It doesn't necessarily terrify us, but we just find ourselves organized. So it's a sort of an existential issue for us to get a better understanding of the ways we find ourselves organized. Okay, moving on. Here's another example of an organized activity. I don't think this will be controversial at all. Dancing. Right? Dancing is spontaneous and seems to be primitive for human beings, exceptionally for human beings. When people dance, that involves the exquisite control, not just of their bodies, but of their attention. Attention to music or attention to the person they're dancing with. So it's a very intelligent activity. Obviously, it's spatio-temporally, rhythmically organized. I assume dancing serves functions, social functions. People dance to meet people. People dance to celebrate. People dance to mourn. People dance to express their feelings. Those are functions in my book. I like to illustrate this idea that dancing has a function by recalling the character of Tony Manero in the 1979 movie Saturday Night Fever. Any of you old enough to remember Saturday Night Fever? Well, darn it, if you haven't seen it, see it tonight. It's a good movie. And it will take you back to the glorious days of disco when I grew up. But it's about a character. It's played by John Travolta, named Tony Manero, who lives in Brooklyn. And to make a fairly long story short, he's got a pretty grim life. His father is abusive. His mother is under his thumb. He has a job which he doesn't do well as a clerk in a hardware store. And his boss, who's kind of a good guy nevertheless, is constantly getting on his case. His life is full of drudgery and displeasure until Saturday night comes, when he puts on his duds, his beautiful fancy three-piece white bell-bottom suit, and goes dancing at the disco. And boy, does he dance. He dances better than all the others. His friends go out and all want different things. Some of his friends are going out to score girls. Some of his friends are actually going out to fight because they're sort of gangsters. He's dancing. But why does he dance? He dances, I think, in order to manifest himself, in order to actualize himself, in order to find himself, and in order to present himself to the world as a thing of value which is sexy and strong and healthy and young and not caught up in this rather grim and unpleasant life situation that he has. So for him, I would submit, and I'm just choosing this as an example, you don't have to look far to find other examples, it shows the kind of psychological functions that dancing can have. As for the other two, dancing is obviously a source of pleasure, and I think when people dance, they don't decide what to do. They can decide what to do, but as a general rule, dancing happens. People get caught up in their dances. They get into the flow. The situation dances for them. The John Travolta is a sort of bad example of that, because they dance all these very fixed move steps, like the hustle and all these kinds of things that they do in the discotheques of the late 70s. But the point stands. Dancing is an organized activity. And now we come to art. I chose dancing because dancing has a relationship to choreography. Choreography is the art of dancing, to give it a quick summation. And my question to you is, how does choreography fit in relation to organized activity? Is choreography an organized activity? And you might say, well, yeah, choreographers make dances, and dancing is an organized activity. But not so fast. If I'm right that dancing is an organized activity, that it's something that we get caught up in and that organizes us, and that serves these kinds of embedded functions in our lives, and that we don't author, then you can't make dancing. It's not the kind of thing you can make. Well, you might say the choreographer doesn't make dancing, but the choreographer stages dancing. And there I want to say, yes, exactly. So what does that mean? What does it mean to stage a dance? Well, it means to put a dance on the stage, or put dancing on the stage, or put the fact that people are dancers on the stage, or put the fact that we are organized by dancing itself on display, or put the fact that dancing matters to us in the center of our attention. In other words, the choreographer is not doing more dancing. The choreographer is, in a way, investigating the place that dancing has in our lives already. The choreographer is exhibiting that we are dancers to ourselves. Now, 2 points about that. One is, if organized activities have this link to biology, and if the choreographer is, and if dancing is an organized activity, and if choreography is exhibiting or investigating dancing in something like the way I'm suggesting, then we begin to see a way of thinking about how choreography is meshing with biology, meshing with the investigation of ourselves thought of biologically, or thought of naturally. It's grappling with our nature. Just this little thin slice of it, the dancing slice of it. Secondly, I said before that we're lost in these nests of organization. My thought is that by choreography putting dancing in our lives on display in the ways that it does, choreography is, if you like, enabling us to get found, if that's correct English. It is orienting us, or disclosing to ourselves this fact about ourselves, and thus helping us be what we are, but if you like, without feeling lost. Wittgenstein once said that philosophical problems have the form, I don't know my way about. So dancing in a way gives us a perspicuous representation of where we are. Heidegger once said that philosophical problems are bringing what's concealed into the open. And I'm suggesting that choreography brings something concealed about us, that we are organized by dancing, into the open. So the work of choreography is both philosophical and also relevant to biology. It makes a contribution in that sense to some kind of an account of ourselves, biologically understood. And this goes back to the thought I shared with you at the beginning, that maybe far from it being the case that scientists and neuroscientists and evolutionary psychologists are going to explain art, maybe art is going to help us frame a more adequate conception of our nature. And this is, I think, an example of the kind of way in which it could happen. Now, again, from what I just said, I hope it's clear. I've chosen choreography as, if you like, a random art practice. And so what I want to say about the relationship between choreography and dancing, I want to say that something like that very same relation holds between all the arts and the different activities that organize us. Now I have two more ideas I want to share with you before I conclude. One way to summarize what I just said is that there's dancing and there's choreography, where we can think of dancing as a first-order organized activity, and choreography as, if you like, a second-order representation of dancing in our lives, a kind of meta-dancing. I called it an investigation. I think it's very important to realize that although what I said just now, that summation, is kind of notionally accurate, it doesn't do justice to the reality. Because in reality, what happens is practices such as choreography influence the way people dance. They loop back down and change the first-order expression of dancing. And they do so in ways that iterate recursively through history, so that, in fact, for us, embedded as we are in history and culture, there's no such thing as dancing immune to the model of what dancing is, which choreography provides to us. Whether it's Michael Jackson or whoever, Mick Jagger, or your mother in the kitchen, who taught me how to do the twist. Whatever the source is, our first-order lived experience with dancing is already shaped and influenced by second-order artistic grapplings with the place of dancing in our lives. Or I might say, with second-order philosophical grapplings with the place of dancing in our lives. That means that even kids dancing at the discotheque, whoever they may be, are in an art space, even if they don't have those intentions and if they're not sort of participating in an art world. And by the way, this looping phenomenon is very, very widespread, and my book discusses this in a lot of different examples. An important example, I'm just going to mention it because I don't want to tire you out with new ideas, but an interesting example is writing and language. Speech is one thing, writing is another. But we, I mean us, live in a scriptural culture. And our conception of language, indeed our conception of our own experience as talkers, is permeated through and through by the picture of what language is that writing provides us. So writing is second order, speech is first order, but in fact it loops back down and transforms. So it's a much more complex, two-directional thing. I think something very similar goes on with pictures. I'll just summarize it in a sentence. I think pictures have changed the way we see. And that's a very interesting fact when you consider that we've been making pictures of the highest quality for at least 30,000 years. All right. So now the point of this last set of remarks is to explain why I say reorganizational practice. Because art doesn't just exhibit our organization to ourselves, it reorganizes us. And it does so not by sort of consciously giving us tools for reorganizing ourselves. It just changes us. And this is very interesting because it points to, I don't know if I emphasize this well enough in the book, but it points to what you might call the emancipatory value of art. The fact of the matter is that all these organized activities, they're habits that we're trapped inside. Ways of looking, ways of moving, ways of seeing, ways of talking, ways of thinking, ways of dressing. They're ways that we're organized not voluntarily. And art, I think, always changes that, and thus changes us, and in a sense, liberates us. Okay, final thought before I stop. I said before that Tony Manero says, look at me, I'm beautiful, I'm sexy, I'm young. Check me out. That's his motto. His motto is, check me out. I think that's exactly not the work of art's motto. The work of art doesn't say, check me out. The work of art says something more like, I dare you, try to see me. Try to bring me into focus. See me if you can. And the interesting thing is, at the beginning, you can't. You're in that gallery space and the pictures all look the same. You need to change yourself to bring the work of art into focus. So I'll conclude with the thought that, if you like, the essential project of the work of art is to say, see me if you can. Thank you very much for your attention.
The last distinction you were making between the level of dance and the level of choreography, I'm actually reminded of an observation that sports video games actually have more in common with how sports is presented on TV than what it's like to actually play the sport. And so this kind of looping back phenomena. I'm curious if you see that as analogous to the experience or analogous to like the user level or the perceiver level versus like the author or designer level. That's something that obviously we think about a lot in terms of this distinction, users and implementers or creators or authors who are actually creating the experience. And thus, part of what seems like you're getting at is creating the norms or the sort of conventions with which the user then understands the experience they're having.
I'm not a programmer, and I don't really know the issues that you face. But one interesting thing that I imagine the programmer faces is designing environments that give the user the affordances the user needs to know what's going on or to make sense, to find the situation intelligible. So for that reason, designers are going to try to tap into the habits and knowledge and expectations that the user brings to the task. Point and click, for example. And then, as you're suggesting, or maybe as we're both suggesting in slightly different words, the user is transformed by their new interface, by their new engagement, and acquires new habits which affect how they think and see and respond outside of the designed environment. And that's remarkable. I mean, that's real evolution. And it's not foreseeable. I mean, there's the silly, stupid examples of it, like when I punch my book trying to get it to turn a page, which if you're tired enough, I'm sure you've all done things like that. I can think of many, many examples where the metaphors and models and paradigms of a virtual space misfire when they're taken over into a non-virtual environment, and yet they'll do so. One of the interesting, if I can just free associate for one moment, it's interesting to think about this in relation to language. One of the big questions that people have always asked about language, not always asked, but I'm thinking of sort of people in the post-Chomskyan world of linguistics have asked, how is it that we can learn language as readily as we can, given how complex it is, and given how little time we have to learn it, and given how poor the linguistic samples are on the basis of which we do learn it, baby talk and inaccurate speech as people slur their words when they're talking. And yet kids get it, and they get it fast. Well, there's an interesting way of turning that idea around on its head. This is not an idea original to me. There's an interesting way of turning that idea around on its head, which is that language, in a way, is a user-friendly system. It's been designed through thousands of years precisely to be learnable by creatures like us. So it's not that we're so smart, it's that the design process, iterated over long periods of time, has turned out to be so efficient. And I think something actually similar, in the book I hypothesize that something similar goes on with pictures. Pictures are old world technology, 30,000-year-old world technology. But we find pictures effortless to interpret. Actually, that's not quite true. We find them effortless to interpret when they come with a caption. If you give a picture out of a context, and all of a sudden, all bets are off. But with the caption in the right context, we find pictures very, very straightforward. So one question is that, and I just give this to you as a question, is that because they tap into the way we naturally see, or is it that they've taught us how to see in the way in which a virtual environment can teach a gamer or a user how to act?
The sort of reorganization that you describe as occurring through art is something that reminds me of what happens with education,
Yeah.
with psychotherapy, with other sorts of situations where you achieve an insight and then you have this nonlinear transition in your understanding of things. Do you see those as part of the same category? And if so, why did you pick art as sort of the prototypical example of it?
The discovery in the book is that there's a phenomenon called reorganizational practice. And art is one. And so is philosophy. And by the way, that's not an orthodox view in philosophy. I mean, there are people in philosophy that would agree with me, but many philosophers think of themselves as seeking knowledge or results, or, or making proofs about the nature of mind and matter and causation. The idea that philosophy is not about discovering truths, but is about reorganizing us, is a debatable view. The argument of the book is that art and philosophy matter to us because they are reorganizational practices. If the value of philosophy depended on the truths that philosophers had established and come to agree upon, philosophy would be in trouble. But it's not a problem for philosophy that no philosopher agrees with another philosopher. Similarly, it's no problem for art that art doesn't converge on a single artistic idea. So I think that the idea that art is a reorganizational practice and that philosophy are reorganizational practices help us answer the kinds of questions I asked at the beginning. What is art? What is philosophy? Why do they matter to us? What do they teach us about ourselves? Now, you're asking a very interesting question. Are there other reorganizational practices? Is psychotherapy, for example, psychoanalysis, a reorganizational practice? This terminology of organization, reorganization is used. It's used in a number of other fields. For example, in the bodywork field, people like Feldenkrais practitioners talk about reorganizing the body's habits to deal with organic problems that the body faces. And I'm open to the possibility that there are other species of the genus than just art and philosophy. So my answer to you, if that's the question, is I didn't mean to suggest that I'd given evidence that only art and philosophy are reorganizational practices. But now there's a further question, which you might be asking, what's the principle of differentiation between them? I thought about that for a long time in a slightly different setting. Most of the features that I think define works of art are also characteristics of jokes. Jokes are sort of cognitively rich. They involve certain kinds of shifts. There's lots of, they exhibit many of the hallmarks of works of art. I don't know if that's a problem for me. Maybe joke telling is a species of art making. But I would, or there's another way. Actually, here's another point that's related. Sorry, my answer is going on much too long. But another point which is relevant is playing the flute is an art form. Dancing hip-hop is an art form. Potting is an art form. Making video installations is an art form. Building buildings is an art form. Those are all totally different kinds of things, right? So maybe the class of things that participate, and I want to say that philosophy belongs on that list. What makes them each art forms, I think, is the way in which they're performing reorganizational work in different neighborhoods of our being. And maybe this is getting closer to something that might have been in the back of your mind, and they're doing so for that reason alone. The artist isn't trying to get a rocket ship to go to the moon or to debug a program. The artist, if I'm right, is trying to give us enlightenment, is trying to help us understand ourselves, and in that sense, open up the possibility of changing ourselves. Maybe that's a very good explanation of what psychoanalysis is doing too. That's a good question. It's an open question to me. Thank you very much. I thank you for your attention.